Sherry is one of the most complex wines out there. Sauterne is always going to have this amazing length and intensity. But sherry in the right hands, you can almost just turn it up. There's so many different colors and different flavors to paint from it. I think they're on the right track in talking about how well it goes with food. Food is a wonderful way to hook people and to get them to want to know more about the wine.
It's a great way into wine itself, but also categories of wine that have maybe suffered from misconceptions. Like sherry has often been pegged as the Oxford Dawn University professor wine behind the books, or granny's wine, or whatever. But it is complex. It's nutty. It's wonderful. It has this range of styles from sweet to dry.
Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 162. Why is sherry one of the most complex wines on the planet and yet also one of the most misunderstood? What's it like to visit the underground caves in Spain where the sparkling wine Cava is aged? And how can you choose between Cava, Prosecco, and Champagne for different occasions or food pairings? You'll hear those answers and more stories during our chat with Lawrence Francis, host of the Interpreting Wine podcast. Now, on a personal note, before we dive into the show with the continuing saga of publishing my new wine memoir. So during a Zoom call my agent and I had with an editor interested in publishing the book, he asked, "Aren't you worried about the controversy this book is going to stir up and the potential backlash for you personally?" I said, well, first off, I'm still a Catholic at heart, so I believe that suffering is good for my soul. It's purifying. And he laughed. But then on a more serious note, I said, what happened to me is part of my story. It's made me who I am. And I'm no longer afraid to talk about it or the consequences of doing so. In fact, I had to write this story to make sense of my life. Actually, to save my life. But more importantly, elements of what happened to me are still happening to many women, and this story is as much for them as it is for me. In my small but mighty group of beta readers, there are lots of comments on the manuscript like, "I can't believe how similar our stories are," and "How did you get inside my head?" And "I wish there was a hug emoji." Aw. But it's not just women who are making these comments. The men who are reading this memoir right now resonate with it for their wives and mothers and daughters. As much as I'd never want to repeat what I went through, I'm glad that some good can come from it, even if it helps just one reader feel like she's less alone and can survive what life throws at her. You'll find a link to the blog post called Diary of a Book Launch, where I share my behind-the-scenes stories, like this one, about the journey of taking this memoir from idea to publication, in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/162. If you want a more intimate insider seat beside me on this journey, please let me know if you'd like to become a beta reader and get a sneak peek at this manuscript. Email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. I'd also love to hear from you if you've discovered a fabulous new wine we should all know about, a tip that would help us enjoy wine more, or a question for me. In the show notes, you'll find my email contact, a link to the Diary of a Book Launch post, the full transcript of my conversation with Lawrence, links to his website and podcast, how you can join me in a free online wine and food pairing class, and where you can find the live stream video version of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube every Wednesday at 7 p.m. That's all in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/162. Okay, on with the show.
So before I introduce our guest fully, I want to let you know that Lawrence Francis has developed a tool to help wine brands diagnose which of the 3 big marketing challenges is currently costing them money and attention online. It's a fairly serious issue. So it's exclusively for winery member listeners of this podcast or wine brands, anyone who manages a wine brand. Lawrence is offering a free one-on-one feedback call to turbo boost, as he puts it, your impact online. You just head to interpretingwine.com/unreserved to take the scorecard. Sounds intriguing. All right. So back to our guest. Lawrence Francis has spent 10 years as a psychologist and coach before entering the wine industry. He is an expert at engaging the wine trade, the industry online via in-depth audio and social media content, generating tens of hundreds of thousands of content hours for regions focused on Austria, New Zealand, Washington State, and Willamette Valley. His own podcast called Interpreting Wine, which is great for both those in the wine industry and for wine lovers themselves. It's really, really great podcast. Now has 450 episodes, woohoo, and more than 300,000 downloads in 150 countries. Lawrence has been featured in both wine trade publications and mainstream media, including The Guardian, The Buyer, Drinks Business, The Financial Times, and the Rochester Business Journal. Welcome, Lawrence. I'm so pleased to have you here.
Yeah, very pleased to be here and great to hear all of those nice things you're able to say.
You've been busy. So you're joining us from your home in London, England. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. West London.
So what's it like? You've got a funky room there. Is that your podcasting room, your studio?
Yeah, this is something that really came out of the first lockdown in 2020 over here. And we were sort of encouraged to work from home. And I think that people, myself included, we wanted to make it as nice as possible and make it as ergonomic as possible. So yeah, I've got a sort of a studio at home here now, and it looks the part. It's kind of always a work in progress when you start getting onto YouTube videos and seeing how people have got their home studio set up. There's a whole rabbit hole to kind of go down with that. But I'm happy with where we're at now.
and for those who are listening to the podcast and not watching the video, you can watch the video, by the way, of this chat. If that's the case, and you're not, on Facebook and YouTube, it's live streamed. But you've got some funky discotheque lighting in the background that you can change, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, that was it. I showed you, gave you sort of a bit of a sneak preview. Depending on my mood, I can change the colors of those, and as we're sort of seeing in the background there.
What's purple saying about your mood right now? Is that a good one?
Yeah, I think purple, it always feels like it goes with anything, really. It feels like, you have lavender in the summer and in autumn, and it always feels quite kind of cozy color for winter and spring as well. So it's one of those, sort of versatile colors.
I'm quite attached to purple myself. But let's dig into the wine. When did you realize you wanted to get into the wine industry? Take us to that moment. What happened?
I think it was maybe kind of the domino effect, really. But I would say I joined the wine industry the first time that I recorded a podcast. As you mentioned in the intro, I'd been working as a psychologist and a coach for many, many years. I hadn't sort of gone through that experience that a lot of other people tend to, working in hospitality or being brought up around wine. It'd always been a little bit of a mystery to me. But the real push, the real impetus came when I was living over in Spain. And I was living in Madrid, which, if you've never been, is an absolutely fantastic city.
Great to visit. Where is it in the country? Is it southeast?
It's right slap bang in the center. And I think that for me, it gives it the advantage over Barcelona because you can explore all the different areas and it's just brilliant. Not your typical sort of boring capital city. It's absolutely amazing. And I wanted to stay. But the challenge there is that even though I do speak Spanish, I think we're naturally a lot more confident working in our native tongue. And there aren't that many jobs for English speakers where you could 100% go into English. But I found one advertised where it was actually going to be a social media manager for a tapas tour company who were attracting all of these visitors and getting them out there.
And taking them around to tapas restaurants?
Yeah. Well, this is the thing, because Madrid is pretty unique and Spain is quite unique because it's got such a long history. And even slap bang in the center, you can find restaurants like where Hemingway used to drink, and they've got these sort of hundreds of years of history. And you literally feel like you're stepping back in time. But to really get the most out of it, you do have to know the language. And I think it kind of does put people off sometimes.
I heard Hemingway liked Spanish rosé. He would drink rosado. Did you ever hear anything about that?
It makes sense because one of the regions that he helped to popularize and the events that he helped to popularize, the running of the bulls, is in Pamplona and in Navarra, which is very, very close to Rioja. And I know that in Pamplona, it's the wine style that they're probably most proud of. There is no other real Spanish wine region that specializes in rosé as much as Navarra and as much as Pamplona.
And the running of the bulls is through the streets, right? Like the bulls are all going through the streets of Madrid? Is that what they do?
Well, no, you do get that in different places around Spain when they're said to be en fiestas, which is like on their holidays, basically. But the most famous is Pamplona. So that's maybe 3 hours or so drive from Madrid. But again, it's back to Madrid being slap bang in the center. You can reach everywhere, Galicia, Barcelona, kind of all around. And I ended up wanting to stay there, but starting the podcast as a sort of a secret weapon to get this job that I really wanted. And long story short, I didn't get the job, but the podcast obviously grew out of that and has kept going for, more than 4 years now since I had that interview. And it was really the push to kind of get me out of Madrid and get me out into visiting wineries and having these tours and just educating myself. And as I say, those first journeys and the first episode is really how and when I entered the wine trade.
Wow, you are brave, starting a podcast and beginning your wine career at the same time. So tell us about the regions you went to in Spain. Which were your favorites, or describe what it'd be like to go visit those regions as well?
Yeah, I guess as any person that likes having a good time, I started in Penedès, which is the region that's most known for Cava. So wanted to start with bubbles. And again, had an inkling that maybe Cava, a difference of opinion in terms of is it as premium as champagne, but they're making it via the same methods. I just thought that was an interesting story to kind of go and explore. And I went there at the sort of midway through their harvest. So it was still very hot at the time, if memory serves correctly.
What did it look like? What was the region like?
Absolutely beautiful. I mean, I was staying in a city called San Serni d'Anoia, which is where they do all of the aging. Basically under the streets of the city, which are really very picturesque cobblestone. They have all of the caves underneath the city. So they've got like literally hundreds of thousands of bottles there. And because of that, the foundations of the city are Cava bottles. Everybody that you meet there, they all work in something related. They either work at a winery or they do design or they run hotels or they run a restaurant. Everything is sort of related to that. But then because it's so small, you drive 5 minutes and you're out into wine country. You're out into the sort of rolling hills. As I say, it was very green when I was there because it was summer, but it's just that natural beauty, I would say, that you have in all of those wine regions. Very vibrant as well.
And what did you notice about Cava that makes it unique from other sparkling wines, say like Prosecco from Italy? Of course, you've got Champagne, you've got sparkling wine in North America and England too. What are the fundamental differences in either the way it tastes and or the way it's made?
Again, going there with an agenda, not just let me go and visit some nice looking wineries. It meant that I was immediately looking for stories. So I remember the 4 wineries I visited the first time. The very first winery that I ever visited, they had, I think it was something like 400 or so acres of property.
Wow. Which one was this?
So this was Bodegas Sumarroca.
Okay.
And
Good accent.
Thanks. But they only had around half of their total area was actually in grapes, which again, kind of, really did blow my mind. So they had all of these other things. They were trying to look after the indigenous flora and fauna, caves. They had sources of water. It was almost like a wildlife reserve, really.
Wow.
But that also had grapes there. I'm pretty sure they also had other products there. They'll tend to have olives and make olive oil and all of these other things. So immediately I just thought that's incredible. That's a story that we never get to hear as consumers. I think it's worked for them to a degree, but often they'll just put forward Cava as, oh, this is champagne method, but a third of the price, or it's a Spanish version of French. And it doesn't get to the nuance and the really amazing quality that you're based around. when you're in that region. Another producer that stands out was Cava. They're known for their extended aging. So again, they'll make sparkling method, secondary fermentation in the bottle. And I think the minimum is 9 months, but we were trying Cavas that had sort of 7 years or 10 years of
Wow.
crianza, of time in the bottle to evolve and develop flavor.
And that was aging on its lees, like on the
Absolutely.
spent yeast cells, basically. Once the
Absolutely.
yeast has done its job, it precipitates. But if you leave it in there, you get this really creamy, bready character. Is that what you were tasting, feeling?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was, again, different grapes to what you would typically have in champagne. So it interacts with the lees in a different way, and it does bring out that sort of that creamy nature. And yeah, sophisticated nature as well, and still quite vibrant because there's so many organic producers down there as well. And I think that does put an extra slant onto the final product as well. I was just fascinated to just scratch the surface with those first few producers.
And now that you've tasted many more wines since, how would you describe the difference between a Cava and a Prosecco in terms of taste? Not technical winemaking methods, but if someone was trying to sort out, oh, do I want to get a Cava, a Prosecco, maybe a Champagne? What do you see are the primary differences?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it has typically tended to be on price that people have tended to put those three in order. I tend to go more by my mood, I would say. So yeah, I think Prosecco is very sort of fruity. Bubbles are always good fun. It's more, I would say, of something that you can kind of have whenever, and you can have it by itself as well. The more everyday Prosecco, it's less for me, less of a food pairing wine. It's more of a just enjoy it cold and just sort of have it fun. I think Cava, for me, again, it's usually a little bit more serious, maybe a little bit more structured. Maybe there is more of a thought towards food with that as well.
Like their tapas. And I always get a more earthy nature from Cava versus Prosecco, as you said, being more fruit forward and
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm a big fan of thinking about these in terms of like hi-fi dials, you kind of probably dial down the fruit with the Cava. And often you're getting, I think, really good value for money because they will tend to try to do longer lees aging. So try to bring out those more complex characteristics and some really interesting examples. And they're also open to using Chardonnay, and they don't only just use the grapes that are most typically associated with Cava, which is like Jardello and Parellada, Macabeo. These are sort of the three that they'll normally use, but they also can use Pinot Noir and they can use International. So sometimes you can get almost, in a sense, more variety because you get the sort of the Cava style, but sometimes they still do, I guess, try to copy Champagne a bit. So you do get, maybe something that's like a Blanc de Noir and is made with 100% Pinot Noir, but comes from Spain rather than France.
Interesting.
I'm not an expert, I would say, on Champagne per se, but I think there's a sort of a stylistic point there. I would say, the real sort of really dry, zero dosage. I personally don't think that anyone does it better than the French, and these, really quite linear and real refreshing wines that come from there. And I think they're really incredible with seafood and oysters. And yeah, I'm a big fan of any of the three, kind of depending on my mood and how flush I'm feeling as well.
Flash, yes. And the color of the lights in your background.
That's it, yeah.
So let's almost go to the opposite end of the spectrum of Spanish wine. Talk to us about sherry. What are the misconceptions? What did you discover? Well, I'm going to not do well on this pronunciation, but is it Jerez? Is that?
In Spain, they would say Jerez.
Jerez.
So the T is like a th.
Okay.
And the J, if you see a J at the start of a word, it's quite harsh. It's like Jerez. It's, not a noise that we have in English. So you kind of have to put your shyness aside in another way because we
just make sure you're not drinking at the time because I think all the wine would come back out. But okay. So what is that region like? Compare it visually or landscape wise to Cava. How do they differ, the sherry region and the Cava regions?
Yeah, it's just to tune in a little bit to the story as well. I mean, I probably only visited 3 different regions when I was living in Spain and left Spain in 2018, but they continued producing, interpreting wine, and then visited again afterwards, kind of coming back there from London. It was my only trip ever to Jerez, was in May 2019, and it was to attend something called the Copa Jerez, which I'm sure you'd love the sound of. Imagine the World Cup of sherry and food pairing.
Oh, yeah, I can get behind that.
I mean, I've not come across any other region of the world that does anything like this, but they basically put almost like a call to entry out globally. They'll have teams from top restaurants all around the world. So the States, Belgium, Spain, the UK.
And these are all sommeliers?
Sommelier chef teams. So it's
Oh,
teams
that's
of
good.
2.
Food and wine.
And they'll compete in their sort of local knockouts against the best restaurants in their countries. They'll put forward their 3 dishes that have each been paired with a sherry to take you through the meal. So it's typically from dry to medium to something more sweet, because sherry has kind of got it all. We're not just going to have dry, we'll have everything. They effectively then they have like a final tournament, a final knockout tournament down in Jerez. So myself and journalists from all of those countries, we're all sort of going around in our teams. And while the competitors were kind of sweating it out over a hot stove and presenting their pairings, typically it was the sommelier who would present the pairings. We were then also in the evenings taken around 2 different bodegas, and then during the daytime also got the opportunity to tour around some producers as well.
That sounds like a very good trip. That sounds
tough life,
Yeah. And so, of the pairings that were presented, what are some of the more memorable ones or surprising ones where you thought, wow, sherry with that? Like, how does that work? And yet it did.
Thinking back is a little bit tough for me, so I may sort of misquote some of the pairings. I luckily got to try from lots of the different sommelier chef pairings. But I think broadly, I seem to remember a pairing that at least had, I think it was like a foie gras was the food component. And it was a fairly sweet sherry, actually, that they put with that. I mean, I think that's something that you do find in other types of food pairings.
Like a cream sherry? Is that what they have?
Yeah, it wasn't a sort of an excess. It wasn't like a Pedro Jimenez. So I think it was, it was sort of a cream or it was a blend, but it just worked so beautifully together.
So instead of a sauterne, which is kind of considered the classic, the sweet wine from Bordeaux, you've got this salty, fatty foie gras and then the sweetness of the wine. I guess the same pairing principles would work in terms of how they go together.
Yeah. What I've always loved about sherry is it's one of the most complex wines out there. I think sweet wines are always, as you say, a sauterne is always going to have this amazing length and it's going to have this amazing sort of intensity. But I just think that sherry, again, in the right hands, you can almost just turn it up. There's so many different colors and different flavors to kind of paint from it. I think they're on the right track, really, in talking about how well it goes with food. I think we're on the same page. Food is a wonderful way to hook people and to get them to want to know more about a wine, to try a wine, and to ultimately...
Yeah, it's a great way into wine itself, but also categories of wine that have maybe suffered from misconceptions. Like sherry has often been pegged as the Oxford Dawn University professor wine behind the books, or granny's wine, or whatever. But it is complex. It's nutty. It's wonderful. It has this range of styles from sweet to dry. What makes it complex in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was something that you just asked about, and I think we'll kind of loop back into this. But I think that the trick they've missed, basically, in a lot of the communication, not all of it, is actually not talking about the grapes. What they would tend to talk about in terms of its complexity would always be around the blending. So essentially focusing on what is it that the bodega or the head winemaker, what is their input here? And for many months, in years almost, I was like, you're not mentioning the grapes. You're not talking about the grapes here. And you're not talking about the soil,
And why would talking about the grapes help, in your opinion?
Because I think ultimately my passion, and I think what people also tell me, is that they want a broad set of stories really from the region. Because just looking at what the winemaker is doing, I think is one element, is one kind of window into that world. But for me, nothing beats standing in the vineyard and actually having an appreciation of, again, the same questions that you've asked me. Where are we? What does it look like? How hot is it? What's around us? Where are the grapes? And sherry has got a fantastic story. You go out into the vineyards and you just see this brilliant white Alberita soil. You get basically blinded
Blinded by the soil.
by the
Wow.
soil. And
What makes it so white?
so I believe it's the chalk component, and it's quite a similar terroir, it's a similar kind of soil to what you find in Champagne. And I think, in Champagne, they're just a lot better at talking about that and talking about what's under the feet. You imagine yourself standing there. What are you stood on? What has that place looked like over the sort of millennia and and I just think there's just so many more avenues to get in there and really hook people rather than just focusing on, oh, we're blending the barrels together. And that's where the complexity comes from.
Yes, and for anyone who's not familiar with the Solera system, it's a fractional blending where, you always have some old sherry. I'm probably going to not get this quite right, but it's always going into the newer barrels so that the average age is a mix of vintages. That itself is quite complex and it's interesting, but you're right, there's more to it than just that.
Yeah, that is in and of itself a fascinating story. But I personally think that, again, making communication relatable, I don't think that's the place to start. I think that you bring that in and you use that as your seasoning further down the line. But I don't think that's the starter. That's not the aperitif. That's not what you give to people straight at the start. And that has been my experience, rightly or wrongly, is that is where they'll always start. And I just think it's like, okay, let's get some context first. And
Right. Yeah, it's almost like starting with the machinery or something. Not that wine is meant to be an industrial product, but I mean, I remember going to so many wineries want to take you to either the presses or the bottling line. It's like, I don't need to see another bottling line, seriously. But over your tastings, what have you enjoyed sherry with? Which pairings have you really loved? And what style of sherry was it?
last year I did the Spanish Wine Scholar, and I think that kind of reignited my love. And I always come back to, I would say, the drier styles of sherry, and the driest of them all, the Manzanilla and the Finos. I think they're fantastic. And your classic pairing there is going to be, some really nice almonds, some olives, and tapas that maybe have a kind of a seafood component as well. So maybe some mackerel. And they're just like that sort of lip smacking salinity that you get from the wines that, it's like you bottled Jerez and you bottled Andalusia in a bottle and you've taken it all around the world and you can just sort of crack that open and transport yourself back there. So I think those definitely do always have a place in my heart.
My mouth is watering as you describe that. And isn't sherry tends to be lower in alcohol than port? Like it is a fortified wine, but still, doesn't it come in like port is 19-20%? Does sherry tend to be lower, like 15 to 17% alcohol?
The two styles that I mentioned there, they will be 15%, and then you'll sort of gradually increase. Something that's maybe slightly stronger would be an Oloroso style, which is then you're getting into the more sort of nuttier, more complex characteristic. But that, I believe, only is going to be around sort of 17.5%. So only, but
only, yeah.
Yeah, as you say, yeah, it's all about context. And I think as well, maybe again, slightly differently to port, I think just that element of you've always got food on the plate in front of you. I think that helps as well, doesn't it, ultimately?
Yes. Yeah, for absorbing and all the rest of it. Absolutely. Would you ever drink sherry throughout a meal? I mean, it's 17%. So do you just maybe have a splash at the beginning or something at the end?
These were conversations that I had. I got to produce a 7-part from memory series while I was down there. So as well as attending the competition and getting to sort of, try all those pairings, actually got to speak to the then head of the Consejo Regulador, so the person who is the strategic brain of sherry. And one of the things that they've been focusing on is, broadening out the appeal and really kind of, this can take you through different courses, but also working with mixologists to put it forward as an ingredient in cocktails. So actually just broadening, I guess, the opportunity, the window that you've got to hook somebody and get them drinking more sherry. So I would absolutely, I don't think I'd get back into Spain if I didn't say this, but I'd absolutely have sherry through a meal. I think that there are so many styles. And then have a sherry cocktail.
Yeah, exactly. The cocktails are interesting because that's got to broaden your base as a product to younger generations. And I would think that sherry itself as a perhaps a base ingredient would be far more complex and adding to those cocktails than a lot of other syrupy concoctions. What kind of cocktails really worked well with sherry? Like, what were they doing with them?
I'm going to have to pass. I'll be honest with you. Maybe they were so good that I can't remember the I can't remember the names of them. But that being said, I do remember like what they were looking for. They were almost looking for this kind of umami characteristic that you get that again, I'm sure you explored this, Natalie, in the past. It's like the words that were used to describe wines and the feel and that kind of that
That savory
minerality, salinity.
deliciousness. Yeah.
That's it. It's pretty much a fact that you have that as a component of food or as a component of a cocktail, you can make something that's just much more complex. And secondly, I don't think there are so many drinks and categories and types of ingredient that will give you that flavor. So it's almost like it's an extra toolkit in the mixologist's belt when they're creating these drinks.
I love that. I'm going to look for a sherry-based cocktail the next time I'm in, I don't know, Manhattan or somewhere.
Yeah, I'm sure you'll find one. I think, yeah, it's just interesting that they've taken that approach. It does really seem to be working for them.
Cool. Well, I want to get to your other regions, but it's fascinating, that deep dive and share it into Spain, rather. Is there anything else you want to add about Spain before we move on to, I don't know, where you want to go next? Austria, Washington?
Yeah, we're doing this virtual travel. Something I would mention, and it's somewhere I've been to a couple of times now, when I was living there and also on a return visit. It's actually Madrid as a winemaking region. I don't think that it necessarily gets the attention that it deserves. Spain is overall, it's one of the highest countries in Europe.
Doesn't it have the most vineyard planted in the world?
I think you're right, actually. Yeah, it is. It makes sense. But they also have many of the older plantings as well. So they don't produce the most in the world.
Right. That's France?
I believe so, yeah. But they have the older vineyards that are maybe slightly less productive, so they get less grapes off, and so as a result, less wine. But Madrid is, the city itself is at sort of 700 or so meters above sea level. And then around them, they've got a mountain range. You're looking at sort of grapes that are coming from 1,000, 1,100 meters, 1,200 meters high, right up there where they get this amazing light coming through. And they make these, incredible, predominantly Garnacha single varietals.
Like Grenache, the Spanish word for Grenache?
Yeah. They would argue that it's Garnacha because apparently Spain has got the oldest genetic material in the world that's ever been found. But we'll leave them to argue that one out. But you can find these wines internationally as well. I know that in the States and in Canada, you can get these. And I really say it's worth checking out Garnacha from Madrid. You'll often see the region described as Sierra de Gredos. That's the name of the mountain range. There's some really cool producers out there, so definitely worth checking out. Yeah.
Wow, that's worth seeking out. Sounds fascinating. Did you get to visit Rioja before we move off Spain?
I did actually. The most in-depth of my visits was actually last year, was actually the start of 2020. So February 2020. Yeah, visited a number of wineries and did a couple of interviews while I was there. I think it's at a really interesting place in terms of its evolution as well. It feels as though generationally there's shifts happening and there's you come across a lot more of the sort of the younger generation coming through. And
how are they changing the style of the wine?
I think that they're moving away from new oak, which has always tended to be the characteristic of Rioja, where they would use a lot of new American oak and they would use the new one, which would impart a really strong characteristic on the wine. But it also means then that for it to be sort of accessible and, drinking at its best, you've got to wait a really long time. And that's why I think you have some fantastic wines that, they're maybe 20 years past the vintage and they're drinking beautifully. But I think if you step away from the new oak in the beginning, then actually you're going to make something that's more drinkable earlier, or it's in its kind of peak drinking window earlier. And I think also even just not using oak at all, using concrete and just using inert containers, inert aging vessels. There's all sorts of experimentation going on there. And I think it's one of those regions where, you scrape away the surface of that quite traditional exterior and you actually find that there's a lot of innovation happening.
Yeah, because traditionally Rioja is kind of classified according to how long it's been aged usually in oak, like Crianza, Reserva, and so on. And I would think that if you're not using new oak or no oak at all, the wine, as you say, is going to be drinking more immediately, but also more accessible perhaps to, again, younger generations who may not want that heavy oak taste up front. Like, I think it would broaden its appeal as well.
100%. And I actually think there's also an interesting point to be made around marketing and around how they communicate as well, because you're quite right. It used to be that you kind of had to have Reserva or Gran Reserva, and that was a key, or that was even the deciding point around how much you could sell it for and whether or not people would buy it. And I just think that as brand has become so much more important, I see, and I've come across many wineries that they say, look, we have our style, as you say, we want it to be more accessible. We don't want this to be such a heavy style. We could put Reserva or Gran Reserva, or we could go for that, but we're not going to. We want it to be our style, and we want to have Rioja on the label, but we don't need, and we don't want to, because stylistically, to have and go for that Gran Reserva. We want to kind of make our own wine, and they say that people respect them for that and will still buy it. It's not a sort of a life or death situation as I think it may have once been.
Right. Wow. Fascinating. Okay.
Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Lawrence. Here are my takeaways. Lawrence reminds us that sherry is one of the most complex, delicious wines on the planet, with its range from dry to sweet and the myriad nutty and other flavors and colors that it creates. That also makes it so food-friendly, from tapas to seafood. 2, it would be magical to visit the underground caves in Spain where the sparkling wine Cava is aged. I enjoyed how he gave us kind of an underground tour of the city in our minds. I can just imagine the millions of resting bottles in those quiet caves. And 3, I found it helpful how he differentiated Prosecco, Cava, and Champagne in terms of food pairings and occasions. In the show notes, you'll find my email contact, a link to the post, Diary of a Book Launch, a full transcript of my conversation with Lawrence, links to his website and podcast, how you can join me in a free online wine and food pairing class, and where you can find the live stream video version of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live every Wednesday at 7 p.m. That's all in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/162. Email me if you have a sip, tip, question, or want to be a beta reader of my new memoir at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. You won't want to miss next week when we continue our conversation with Lawrence. In the meantime, if you missed episode 18, go back and take a listen. I chat about wine and dieting, including diets such as the keto, paleo, gluten-free, Atkins, South Beach. In other words, does wine make you fat? Just trying to be helpful here in case you've made some New Year's resolutions. There's good news. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite. Regular moderate wine drinkers tend overall to be slimmer than teetotalers, according to a study published in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition. A 1991 Harvard study, which followed 138,000 men and women over 10 years, found that increasing their alcohol intake didn't cause the subjects to gain weight. In fact, the women decreased their body weight by an average of 15% instead of gaining the weight predicted according to the calories they consumed. Intriguingly, the men's weight stayed the same. Scientists were mystified about this because it runs counter to the expectation of wine being fattening, since it does add calories and should give us the munchies. Wine raises blood sugar levels and then drops them quickly, which can result in food cravings. One reason for the lack of weight gain may be that the human body treats alcohol like a toxin. If you liked this episode, please tell one friend about it this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in the wines we discussed. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps an Amontillado sherry. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.